A waitress was cornered by rude men. Hell's Angels helped her finish the night safely. "Please, just let me close. I have to go home." Cora Mae Gallagher whispered the words under her breath. But even that felt dangerous with Earl and Vince still sitting in the back booth, watching her like they owned the last hour of her life. It was 11:42 p.m., 42 minutes past closing, and the 26-year-old waitress had only $37.18 in tips folded inside her apron pocket, one shoe split near the heel, and a rent notice waiting on the passenger seat of her old sedan outside. Her hands were raw from dish soap. Her smile was gone. The Comet Diner should have been dark by now, but Earl kept tapping his empty coffee cup against the table, slow and hard, while Vince laughed every time Cora reached for the switch beneath the faded last call sign. The kitchen phone sat behind the counter, 10 steps away. Earl stood between her and those 10 steps. If she tried to lock the door, he would be close enough to stop her before her fingers touched the bolt. Then the windows trembled. A deep V-twin rumble rolled across the empty parking lot, shaking the sugar caddies on the nearest table before cutting into a silence so sharp Cora forgot to breathe. The front door opened with a slow wooden groan, and Gideon Bear cross-stepped inside, his creaking Hell's Angels-style leather vest dark with road dust, old scars visible across his tattooed hands, his massive shadow stretching over the checkered floor until it nearly touched Cora's worn-out shoes. 2 more leather-clad bikers followed behind him, silent and broad-shouldered, their boots landing heavy on the worn linoleum. The smell of old leather, hot rubber, and burnt coffee drifted across the counter as the room seemed to shrink around Cora. The air in the Comet Diner, already thick with Cora's anxiety and the rude men's belligerence, now hummed with an entirely new, unpredictable, and powerful energy. The new silence in the Comet Diner felt heavier than the earlier noise, pressing down on Cora Mae Gallagher as the 3 Hell's Angels moved with an unhurried, almost deliberate confidence. Gideon Bear Cross, his gaze steady and calm, scanned the room once more, his eyes lingering for a moment on the 2 men in the back booth, before gesturing with a slight tilt of his head towards a specific table. It was not the farthest booth, tucked away in a corner, nor the closest to the door, but one positioned strategically. It was directly across the aisle from where Earl and Vince sat, making it impossible for the rude men to ignore their imposing presence. Bear and his 2 brothers, equally large and silent, slid into the booth, their leather vests creaking softly with the movement. They did not speak, simply settling in, their faces unreadable, their eyes taking in the diner's faded charm and the lingering tension. Cora, still frozen behind the counter, felt a new kind of fear prickle her skin, a different sensation than the dread Earl and Vince had instilled. She had been worried about the rude men, but these bikers, with their quiet power and controlled movements, felt like an entirely different, unknown threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, charged quiet of the diner. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, trying desperately to remember her training. Treat every customer the same, no matter how intimidating, no matter how unexpected their arrival. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, Cora forced her feet to move. She grabbed a small pad and pencil, her hand trembling slightly as she walked towards the biker's booth, her professional smile feeling like a fragile mask, stretched too thin across her pale face. "Can I get you gentlemen anything?" she asked, her voice coming out a little higher and more strained than she intended, betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. Bear looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly. There was no aggression in his gaze, no overt threat, only a calm, assessing look that made her feel both thoroughly scrutinized and, strangely, seen, as if he understood more than she had spoken. "Just 3 coffees black," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly polite and even-toned. Cora nodded quickly, scribbling the order onto her pad, trying to keep her eyes focused on the paper, avoiding his intense gaze. She could feel Earl and Vince's stares from their booth, their earlier boisterousness completely gone, replaced by a palpable apprehension. They were watching the bikers, their expressions a mix of curiosity, resentment, and a dawning unease. For a fleeting, desperate moment, Cora felt a flicker of hope. Maybe these men, with their imposing presence, would scare Earl and Vince away, finally allowing her to close the diner. But then she glanced back at the rude men. They were still there, rooted to their seats, not making a move to leave, their eyes, though less bold and defiant, still holding a stubborn, almost petulant refusal to depart. A fresh wave of unease washed over Cora, chilling her to the bone. The bikers might have quieted them, but they had not made them disappear. She was still trapped, still needing to close, and now there were 5 men in the diner instead of 2, all watching her, all contributing to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The 3 Hells Angels settled into their booth, their coffee cups now placed before them on the worn formica table, steaming gently in the dim light. Gideon Bear Cross took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes calm as he surveyed the diner, his gaze missing nothing. The quiet, unwavering presence of the bikers had indeed subdued Earl and Vince, but it had not made them leave. They still occupied their booth, though their conversation had dropped to a low, disgruntled murmur, punctuated by uneasy, furtive glances towards Bear and his brothers. Cora Mae Gallagher, her initial surge of fear giving way to a more persistent, gnawing anxiety, moved through her routine with practiced, almost mechanical motions. She refilled the sugar caddies, wiped down the salt and pepper shakers with a damp cloth, and straightened the napkin dispensers, her movements precise, but her hands, however, were not as steady as she wished. She kept her back mostly to Earl and Vince, but she could feel their eyes on her, a heavy, unwelcome weight that pressed against her shoulders. She also felt the biker's presence, a different kind of weight, watchful and still, a silent anchor in the room. Bear watched Cora. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she poured fresh coffee into a mug, ostensibly for a new, phantom customer, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic. He saw the way her shoulders were hunched, a subtle defensive posture, and how she avoided making direct eye contact with the men in the back booth, her gaze always flicking away at the last second. Her smile, when she offered it to the empty air, was tight, a professional mask that did not quite hide the deep strain and exhaustion etched around her eyes. He remembered the flicker of desperate hope in her eyes when he and his brothers first entered, quickly replaced by a fresh wave of unease when Earl and Vince did not immediately depart, their stubborn refusal to leave hanging heavy in the air. It was a familiar pattern, the way people tried to make themselves invisible when they felt threatened, hoping the problem would simply go away if they did not acknowledge it. Bear had seen it before, too many times, in too many different settings. He shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze lingering on Earl. Something about the man's face, the aggressive set of his jaw, and the way he kept testing the edges of the room, told Bear enough. He did not need a newspaper clipping or a police report to understand the pattern. Men like Earl did not start with violence. They started with small trespasses, staying too long, speaking too loud, blocking a path, making a tired worker feel like her own workplace no longer belonged to her. Bear had seen that pattern before. He knew the danger was not in a fist. It was in the slow theft of someone's dignity. Bear's resolve solidified, hardening into a quiet determination. He would not let Cora face this alone, not when he knew what these men were capable of. His brothers, silent and observant, also seemed to sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Their eyes, though not directly staring, were always aware of the back booth, their presence a silent, collective shield. Cora, meanwhile, made another circuit, picking up a strained napkin from a table, her mind racing. She knew she had to try again to get them to leave, to finally close the diner, but the thought of approaching Earl and Vince, even with the bikers present, made her stomach clench with renewed dread. The last call sign still waited, unlit, a symbol of her unfinished, unsafe night, a task she felt powerless to complete. The tension in the Comet Diner thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on Cora Mae Gallagher, making the air feel heavy and difficult to breathe. She had desperately hoped the bikers' silent, watchful presence would be enough to make Earl and Vince leave, to finally break their stubborn hold on her night. But the rude men remained, their low murmurs a constant, irritating hum in the background, a reminder of her predicament. Cora knew she could not wait all night. Her shift had to end, her responsibilities called. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady her nerves, her hands clenching and unclenching beneath the counter. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she walked towards the back booth, her movements slow and deliberate, each step feeling heavy and uncertain. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carefully polite, striving for a tone of professional calm despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "I am really sorry, but we need to close up soon. It has been a long night, and I have to get home." Earl, who had been slouched low in his seat, his eyes half closed in a lazy, insolent way, suddenly straightened with an abrupt jerk. His smirk returned, wider and more unpleasant than before, a chilling display of his deliberate malice. He slapped his large hand on the worn formica table, making the empty coffee cups rattle in their saucers, the sound cracking through the quiet diner. "Another coffee, sweetheart," he demanded, his voice loud enough to fill the room. "And bring us 2 slices of pie while you are at it. We are not going anywhere." Vince snickered beside him, a low, guttural sound, his eyes lingering on Cora in a way that made her skin crawl, a feeling of unease washing over her. Cora felt a hot flush creep up her neck, her cheeks burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. They did not want coffee. They did not want pie. They wanted her to keep serving them after closing, to prove that her time, her safety, and her right to go home meant nothing. "Sir, we are closed," Cora replied, her voice barely a whisper, trying desperately to keep her tone even, to maintain a shred of professional dignity. "And as I said, we are closing. I need to turn off the last call sign, so I can finish up." She gestured vaguely towards the neon sign above the counter, hoping to convey the urgency, the legitimate reason for her request. But Earl simply leaned back, crossing his thick arms over his chest, a challenging, defiant glint in his eyes that promised trouble. "Oh, you need to, do you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt heavy and menacing, he pushed himself out of the booth and took a step towards her, blocking her path to the counter. He was a large, imposing man, and his presence felt like a solid, unyielding wall, trapping her between his booth and the empty space near the kitchen door. "I do not think so, little lady. We are not done here. Not yet." Cora felt her heart leap into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her breath hitched, ragged and shallow. Her face went pale, and she could feel the blood draining from her fingertips, leaving them cold and numb. She was truly cornered now, physically intimidated, with no escape route, no other customers to witness, no one to help. Her eyes darted around frantically, searching for an exit, a witness, anything that might offer a glimmer of safety. The diner, which had felt merely tense moments before, now felt truly dangerous, suffocating her with its sudden, menacing quiet. Her gaze flickered towards Bear and his brothers. They were watching, silent, their faces unreadable, and for a terrifying second, Cora felt utterly alone, completely abandoned to the mercy of these 2 men. Cora Mae Gallagher felt a cold dread spread through her, a paralyzing fear that rooted her to the spot as Earl's large, menacing frame blocked her path. His sneer was a physical thing, pressing down on her, robbing her of precious air, making her chest tighten painfully. Her eyes, wide with terror, flickered desperately to Gideon Bear Cross and his brothers in their booth. For a terrifying, gut-wrenching second, she felt utterly abandoned, a small, fragile thing caught between 2 unknown forces, neither of which seemed to offer her safety or protection. But Bear had seen it all unfold with a quiet, unwavering intensity. He had watched Earl's deliberate, aggressive movement, the way the man had cornered Cora against the counter, cutting off her escape route with a calculated, intimidating posture. He saw the stark, raw terror in her eyes, the way her hand instinctively went to her throat, a silent, desperate plea for help that needed no words. It was a look he knew too well, a haunting expression that resonated deep within him. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at him, bringing with it a familiar, bitter taste of regret. Years ago, in a different town, outside a late-night grocery counter, he had watched a tired young woman, not much older than Cora, being cornered by a group of loud, entitled men. He had been younger then, less sure of himself, more inclined to mind his own business, and he had done nothing. He had tucked his receipt into his jacket, looked away, and kept walking, leaving her to fend for herself, to endure the humiliation alone. The image of her defeated slump, the way she had smoothed her apron over and over, her shoulders bowed in quiet resignation, had haunted him for weeks, a persistent, uncomfortable sting in his conscience. He had told himself it was not his fight, that he should not interfere, that it was not his place. But the quiet sting of regret, the feeling of having failed to uphold a basic principle of decency, of having abandoned someone in need, had never truly left him. He had promised himself then, in the quiet solitude of his thoughts, that he would not stand by again, not when a good person was being pushed around, especially when they were just trying to make an honest living, trying to survive. He took a slow, deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Earl. The man's bluster, his aggressive posturing, was a thin, transparent veneer over something ugly and deeply insecure, something Bear recognized from that old, painful memory. He knew that a direct, aggressive confrontation would only escalate the situation, potentially making it worse for Cora, drawing more attention and possibly leading to violence. His goal was not to fight, not to cause a scene, but to subtly shift the atmosphere, to make the rude men feel exposed and uncomfortable, to gently but firmly remove the oppressive pressure from Cora, without a single raised voice or threatening gesture. Bear's eyes met those of his two brothers, who sat quietly in their booth, their faces calm but intensely alert, their own gazes fixed on the unfolding scene. They had been watching too, their presence a silent, unwavering support. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of the escalating situation and the unspoken need for intervention. They were ready, their collective presence a formidable, yet controlled, force. Bear felt a quiet resolve settle within him, a solid, unshakable anchor in the swirling tension of the diner. He would not let this night end with Cora feeling defeated, humiliated, and unsafe. He would not repeat his past mistake. He shifted his weight imperceptibly, preparing to move, his presence about to become more than just an observation. The time for silent watching, for passive witness, was over. It was time to act, not with anger or aggression, but with the steady, quiet force of a man who knew his purpose, who understood the subtle power of presence. Gideon Bear Cross's quiet resolve solidified, a calm, unwavering counterpoint to the rising, suffocating fear in Cora Mae Gallagher. He saw the way Earl's large body language pressed in on her, physically intimidating her, the way Cora's shoulders hunched, trying instinctively to make herself smaller, to disappear. The memory of his past inaction, that persistent, bitter sting of regret, propelled him forward with a quiet, determined urgency. He would not allow Cora to experience the same humiliation and fear he had witnessed years ago, the same feeling of helpless abandonment. He moved slowly, deliberately, pushing himself up from the booth with a controlled grace that belied his considerable size. There was no sudden aggression in his movements, no hurried, abrupt action that might escalate the volatile situation. He stretched his broad shoulders, a natural, unthreatening action that nevertheless drew the eyes of everyone in the diner, a subtle shift in the room's focus. Earl and Vince, who had been focused solely on Cora, watched him, their own expressions shifting from smugness to a flicker of uncertainty, a dawning apprehension. Bear then began to walk, not directly towards Earl, not with any confrontational intent, but towards the counter, his path taking him precisely past the rude men's booth. His heavy boots made soft, measured thuds on the worn linoleum, each step deliberate and unhurried. He did not look directly at Earl, did not acknowledge his presence directly, but his chosen path brought him squarely and unmistakably between Cora and the man who was cornering her, creating an immediate, physical barrier. It was a subtle, yet profoundly powerful, act of interposition, a silent declaration of protection. Cora, her breath still hitched in her throat, watched him approach, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She did not know what to expect, her mind racing frantically, trying to predict his next move. Would he confront Earl? Would he demand something? Would he simply walk past? Instead, Bear stopped at the counter, placing himself squarely between Cora and Earl, his broad back a solid, unmoving shield. He turned his head slightly towards Cora, his eyes calm and steady, a reassuring anchor in the storm of her fear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, even rumble, cutting through the tense silence. "Could we get the check for our table, please? We have been here a while." His words were simple, polite, and direct, a mundane request, but their effect was immediate and profound, an unexpected force. Earl, who had been leaning aggressively into Cora's personal space, visibly recoiled a step, his body language deflating. The invisible wall of his intimidation, which had felt so solid and inescapable to Cora, had just been broken, shattered by Bear's quiet presence. He was no longer directly facing Cora, no longer in control of the interaction, but now had Bear's broad, unyielding back and the silent, watchful gazes of Bear's brothers from their booth to contend with. Vince, still rooted in their booth, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously between Bear and Earl, a clear sign of his own unease. The bravado that had filled the diner moments before, fueled by their perceived power over Cora, was cracking, replaced by an awkward, almost childish silence. Cora, suddenly no longer trapped, no longer cornered, felt a rush of air to her lungs, a gasp of relief escaping her lips. She looked at Bear, his back a comforting presence, then back at Earl, who now seemed smaller, less threatening, his posture deflated, his smirk replaced by a scowl of frustration. The power dynamic in the Comet Diner had irrevocably shifted, not with a shout or a fight, but with a quiet, deliberate presence and a simple, polite request that carried the weight of unspoken authority. Earl and Vince, unnerved by the sudden, deliberate shift in the diner's atmosphere, exchanged uneasy, agitated glances. Earl, who had been pressing in on Cora Mae Gallagher with such aggressive confidence, now found Gideon Bear cross his broad back squarely between them, a silent, unmoving barrier that completely disrupted his intimidation. Bear's calm request for the check, delivered in an even, unthreatening tone, had punctured the tense bubble of control Earl had so carefully created. The rude man's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation, then confusion, and unmistakably, a dawning discomfort. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer dictating the terms of the interaction, no longer in control of the situation. Instead, he was being observed, not just by Bear, but by Bear's two brothers who remained seated, their gazes unwavering, fixed on the back booth with a quiet intensity that felt unnerving. Vince, still hunched in their booth, mumbled something to Earl, a low, urgent whisper that Cora could not quite make out, but its meaning was clear from their body language. "This is not going as planned, and we are losing face." The bravado that had fueled their earlier taunts, their stubborn refusal to leave, had completely evaporated, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. It was replaced by a palpable awkwardness, a sudden, chilling realization that their audience had changed, and their performance was no longer effective or even safe. Earl's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, a subtle but significant surrender of his aggressive posture. He looked around the diner, his eyes avoiding Bear's back, avoiding Cora's pale, watchful face, searching desperately for an escape route, a way to regain some semblance of dignity, any path that did not involve direct confrontation. There was none. The quiet, steady presence of the Hells Angels, their collective, unyielding gaze, had boxed them in more effectively than any shouted threat or physical altercation ever could have. With a frustrated sigh that was more a huff of petulance than genuine resignation, Earl reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled wad of bills. He slammed them onto the table in front of Vince, a childish gesture of anger rather than a simple payment. Vince quickly counted out their share, his movements jerky and hurried, adding it to Earl's pile, his fingers fumbling slightly with the money. "Let's just go," Vince muttered, his voice barely audible, pushing himself out of the booth with an awkward scrape of the seat. Earl nodded, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation, his eyes still avoiding contact with anyone in the diner. They did not look at Cora, did not look at Bear, did not acknowledge the bikers. They simply pushed past their table, their chairs scraping loudly on the worn linoleum, and walked quickly, almost stumbling, towards the diner door, their hurried exit a stark contrast to their earlier swagger. The heavy wooden door swung open, letting in a gust of cool, refreshing night air, then slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud, leaving a sudden, echoing quiet in the Comet Diner. Cora let out a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding, a profound, shuddering release of fear. The silence that followed their departure was not empty. It was filled with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief, a lightness that spread through her chest, making her feel as though she could finally breathe freely again. Her hands, which had been trembling uncontrollably moments before, slowly began to steady, the tension draining from her fingertips. She looked at Bear, who still stood calmly at the counter, his back to her, a silent, powerful guardian, and then back at the now empty booth where Earl and Vince had been. They were truly gone, vanished into the night, and the danger had passed. Cora Mae Gallagher's profound relief was a physical sensation, a lightness that made her feel as though she could finally breathe again, deeply and freely. The echoing quiet left by Earl and Vince's hasty, undignified departure was a balm to her frayed nerves, a soothing hush after the jarring tension. She watched the diner door for another long moment, just to be absolutely sure they would not return, before slowly turning her gaze to Gideon Bear Cross, who still stood calmly at the counter. He had not moved since asking for the check, his broad back a silent, protective presence that had shielded her from the rude men's final, lingering stares. Cora's voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, thick with emotion, a fragile sound that barely broke the quiet. "Thank you," she managed, the words catching in her throat, a lump of gratitude making it difficult to speak. Bear slowly turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was no triumph in his gaze, no expectation of effusive praise, only a quiet, deep understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the difficult moment they had just navigated. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, a gesture that spoke volumes without a single word, conveying respect and support. He then pulled out his wallet, counting out the money for his coffee and those of his brothers with unhurried precision. He placed the crisp bills on the worn counter, making sure to leave a generous tip beside them, a clear and tangible acknowledgement of her hard work and the difficult, frightening night she had endured. He did not ask for a lengthy thank you. He did not turn the moment into a speech. Instead, his eyes moved once toward the dark parking lot, then back to Cora. "That your sedan out there?" he asked quietly. Cora nodded, embarrassed for reasons she could not explain. "The blue one. It does not always start right away." Bear gave a small nod to one of his brothers, who stepped outside without a word. A minute later, the man returned and held up 2 fingers. "Rear tire is low," he said. "Almost flat." Bear looked back at Cora. "Lock up first. We will wait." Cora stared at him, too tired to answer, then nodded once. For the next 4 minutes, while she counted the drawer and gathered her keys, the bikers stayed near the front windows, quiet and patient, their leather vests creaking softly when they shifted. Outside, one of them pulled a compact air compressor from a saddlebag and filled the rear tire of her old sedan until the gauge read 32 psi. It was not a miracle. It was just help. When Cora finally stepped outside, the night air carried the smell of hot rubber, engine oil, and cold pavement. Bear handed her the receipt and the folded tip. "You earned a safe night, ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady. Then he and his brothers mounted their bikes, the V-twins rumbling awake one by one, and rode out of the lot only after Cora's sedan turned over on the second try. Cora Mae Gallagher sat behind the wheel for a moment, both hands resting on the cracked vinyl steering wheel as the old sedan idled unevenly beneath her. The last echoes of the motorcycle engines faded down the rural Ohio road, leaving the parking lot still again. The Comet Diner no longer looked like a cage behind her. It looked like a place she had survived with her dignity intact. The folded tip sat beside the rent notice on the passenger seat, but it was not the money that stayed with her most. It was Bear's quiet sentence. "You earned a safe night, ma'am." Her hands, which had been clenched tight in anxious fists for hours, slowly relaxed. The cold knot in her stomach loosened. She looked through the windshield at the dark front windows, at the faded last call sign now switched off inside, and understood what had changed. For so long, that sign had felt like proof that she could not set a boundary. Now it meant the opposite. She had closed the diner. She had locked the doors. She had walked out on her own terms. As she drove away, leaving the Comet Diner behind, Cora Mae Gallagher did not feel rescued like a helpless person. She felt respected like a human being. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.